Intermittent fasting has been such a conversation in the health and wellness space for a number of years now, and for good reason. It's something I believe in and do on a regular basis. But how does that play into the whole blood sugar piece? Obviously on an acute level, we're not consuming anything that's going to spike insulin, spike the blood sugar, but it is causing that acute stress on the body. Does that ever impact blood sugar? And then over time, having that as a regular practice, how does that impact blood sugars?
Yeah. So, in terms of over the long term, intermittent fasting and time restricted feeding is overall a positive for metabolic health and blood sugar. And it really gets back to all the liver stuff that we talked about before. When you are not eating and in that fasting window, your body's having to work through its circulating glucose. Then it's going to tap into its short term glucose stores, which is the glycogen that's stored in the liver. And then once you get through that glycogen that's in the liver, the body's going to say, I still need energy, but we've kind of worked through most of the glucose. So then it starts going into your fat storage, which is our sort of long-term bank of energy that we're not going to really tap into unless insulin is low and unless you've worked through some of your stored glucose. So that's incredible. So when I'm thinking about when I'm doing a fast, I'm so motivated by this visualization in my head of like my body working through these storage depots and finally getting to that fat depot and starting to use it. And when you start using fat and train your body through fasting to intermittently tap into the fat storage, you start working those pathways, those metabolic pathways of fat oxidation and fat burning. And I think for the average American, they're really rarely, if ever, getting to that stage of where they need to tap into fat. Because we're constantly eating. We're eating around the clock. We're eating so much abundance of refined sugars and carbohydrates that your body never needs to use its fat, which is why 74% of Americans are overweight or obese, because we are not tapping into our fat stores. So that's really what I'm thinking about. And I love also testing my ketone levels, which are byproduct of fat oxidation when I'm fasting, because I can see that as I fast and I know that my glucose, I can see on my continuous glucose monitor, it's starting to come down and my ketones are starting to come up, and watching that dance between glucose and ramping up fat oxidation is incredibly motivating. And so that, and seeing that objectively is direct evidence of metabolic flexibility, this term that we talk about a lot, which is basically saying, if you're metabolically flexible, you're someone who can bounce between burning glucose when it's available, but then also burning fat when glucose is not available. And most of us are metabolically inflexible because we're never giving the body the opportunity to go there. And when we clear out the liver of stored glucose, it's also just really a healthy opportunity for the body to not be constantly barraged by the insulin, and kind of just work through what's in there. Clear out the gunk is kind of how I'm thinking about it. So there's lots of different ways and I would say one other thing that is really coming to light through some great books like Sarah Gottfried's Women, Food and Hormones, Steve Gundry's The Keto Code, is that the benefits that we see from like maybe a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet, you can actually, a backdoor to some of those benefits is, without having to be so restrictive, is fasting. Because what Sarah Gottfried argues is that women need more carbohydrates. And sometimes it is very stressful for the female body to be on such a low carb diet. So what does it look like to incorporate a little bit more carbohydrates and healthful carbohydrates that don't spike your glucose as much, but then use intermittent fasting and even something as simple as like a 14-hour circadian fast, where you're basically just eating during daylight hours and not eating when it's dark, that actually can bump you into ketosis without actually having to restrict as much of the carbohydrates. And then Steve Gundry takes this farther with his new book, which is absolutely fascinating, which is about how those ketones, which can be produced from the fasting, or of course, in conversation with a lower carb diet, then go to the body and go to the mitochondria and stimulate that mitochondrial uncoupling that I was talking about, where the mitochondria actually waste calories. So ketones actually act as a signaling molecule to tell the mitochondria to vent these protons and essentially waste calories, which is one of the reasons why keto diets, or diets that produce ketones, i.e. what can happen through intermittent fasting, actually help with weight loss, because they are literally causing us to waste calories and not store them. So So I think there's definitely a huge role for it. And, you're giving your body a break from the insulin barrage. You're also giving your microbiome a break, which is good, letting sort of things, giving your gut lining a break. And I think the other thing that's, interesting is that eating late at night we really know more and more that that's not healthy for the body. And so that can fit in nicely with a time restricted feeding sort of strategy where you're stopping eating a little bit earlier in the night than you do normally, like 6 p.m. or 7 p.m., at least giving yourself 3 or 4 hours before your last meal and bedtime, because we actually become a little bit more insulin resistant at night naturally. So the same meal that you eat at 8 in the morning, if you ate that at 10 p.m. at night, you're likely to have a much bigger glucose and insulin response if you eat it at 10 p.m. at night, even though it's the exact same meal. And this is for a lot of reasons. One theory is that melatonin secretion, which happens at, more at night to kind of, in part that helps make us sleepy, the melatonin may actually impact the pancreas and our insulin secretion. And so there also may be impacts on how our cells are actually sensitive to the insulin that is secreted. And so when I think about when I'm eating, I'm like, I want to get the best bang for my buck on the calories that I'm eating. So I'd prefer to eat it, in the daylight hours earlier in the day and not kind of get this unfortunate, like double whammy, more glucose, more insulin if I'm eating it late at night. And when you have a spike at night, like, because you're eating a late meal, a spiking crash at night, and of course, it's probably going to be a bigger spike and a bigger crash, can really disrupt sleep architecture and make the sleep that we're getting less restorative, because the body responds to a big up and a big down as a stress signal. And that can actually cause arousal in the brain. And so we want to keep glucose as stable as possible, sort of as we head into bedtime. For the best sleep quality. So again, that fits nicely into sort of a time restricted feeding regimen where we're kind of wrapping up dinner a little bit earlier in the night.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
If you are an American born today, you are on a direct trajectory towards having a blood sugar problem, having metabolic dysfunction, and having insulin resistance. And this will increase